Welcome back to Numa, the crossroad of science and enlightenment. Today, I'm sitting down again with Victoria. Say hi, Victoria.
Hi.
For part two of our conversation, and this time we're going to take a look at the New Mexico bill that just happened. I mean, from the last time that we spoke, there was a lot of things that were going on. I mean, Oprah was talking about psychedelics with Michael Pollan. New Mexico, we had kind of briefly talked on our last podcast about what was happening over there. And now this Psilocybin Medical Act, it's gone through all of the legislative channels, if you will. And I want to talk about that because this is more than just a state level bill. This is a signal that it's kind of a movement in psychedelics and it's evolving fast. And the lines between science and policy and healing are starting to blur. But let's be real, it's complicated. What does it actually mean for a state to decriminalize therapy? And what are the ripple effects? What should we expect when we're looking at legislation like this? So today, we're going to unpack four critical conversations. New Mexico Psilocybin Act. What is decriminalization? What's legal? What is medical? What is the difference between it? Why does it really matter? What do employers and employees, why they should be paying attention to this? And why does it matter? From mental health to legal to future coverage, we're going to kind of get into all of it. So, welcome everyone to Numa and welcome Victoria to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Ellen. I'm so glad to be here.
Absolutely. So, let's jump into it. So, the last time that we spoke, there was kind of a lot going on as we had talked about.
Mhm.
And you and I were really just kind of tapping into what was happening in New Mexico. And now it seems like some things have been happening there.
Right. So the New Mexico Medical Psilocybin Act has passed out of the House and the Senate. It's now on the governor's desk, and she has until April 5th to sign. Even if she does sign, in New Mexico, like a lot of other states, she has the ability to line item veto. So there's a lot of advocacy going on right now, not only to prompt the governor to sign the bill. We know this is her last term. We don't know what her political goals are after this. So we want to reassure her that this has the support of New Mexicans across all parties and across all aspects of society while she makes this decision. We also want to encourage her to sign the bill as written. There are some financial aspects to this bill that are going to affect New Mexico's budget. Specifically, as we talked about last time, the New Mexico Medical Psilocybin Act includes two revolutionary legislative elements: an equity fund and a research fund. New Mexican senators and House of Representatives members have stated we want psilocybin access in a medical context to be equitable. Now we have to fund it. So everyone is encouraging the governor to take a hard look at this legislation, understand its revolutionary aspects, and not only legalize medical access to psilocybin under certain circumstances, but invest in it. And that's the difference.
So, kind of walk me through what that looks like, because as we were kind of talking about in the beginning, I mean, this is like such a different shift. I mean, we've seen Oregon, we've seen Colorado. It's like every state has kind of their own versions. Why is this one so unique? And to me, I mean, it just sounds absolutely incredible that we're investing in the future with having these two funds.
Right. So New Mexico benefits from the advocacy that happened in Oregon and Colorado. And we've had a little bit of time here to see what has happened in Oregon and Colorado, how access is starting to shake out, and what it is that we might want to do differently as a state that's very rural, that has a very diverse population, and that has some language and financial barriers to treatment that might not exist in the same intensity in the rest of the country. What we've done with the New Mexico Psilocybin Act is really acknowledge the reality of psychedelic assisted therapy in America right now. Currently, there are only 5 states under whose Medicaid you can get ketamine assisted therapy covered. It is,
Let's talk about that a second, because I
yes.
know we're kind of on a ketamine task force, and this is a conversation that's kind of near and dear to our heart. So, what 5 states are those, and what does that actually look like?
Yeah. So if I recall correctly, it's Texas, it's Oregon, California, and then there are 2 others.
Wisconsin just passed.
Wisconsin, that's correct. And do you
Yeah,
happen to recall the other
I'm
one?
trying to remember what the last one was. So, listeners, if you want to chime in on this one, that would be perfect.
Yeah, but there are only these 5, right? And it is notable that as 2 people in the psychedelics community and in this conversation, we have a hard time even recalling what the 5 states are because it's a very little used benefit. Having this covered under Medicaid means that under certain circumstances, certain providers who are offering authorized protocols can get reimbursements for offering that treatment. That's one of the only ways that someone can access psychedelic assisted therapy in America without having to pay out of pocket.
And that really is Spravato.
Right.
I mean, so when we're talking about ketamine, there's intramuscular, there's the lozenge, there's the IV, and then we have Spravato. And Spravato really is the only one that we're talking about that's actually covered under insurance.
Right. There are so few ways that people don't have to pay out of pocket. There's the VA program that offers a standard protocol of IV ketamine, and then there's these 5 states that offer their ketamine assisted therapy via Medicaid through the nasal spray Spravato. It is incredibly complicated as an individual person to get a reimbursement back for funds that you may spend on psychedelic assisted therapy. And this is despite the fact that you treating your mental illness has an economic benefit to all of us. We know that healthier, happier people are more productive people, and yet we force everyone who needs this particular kind of treatment to pay out of pocket to become that more productive member of society. This is deeply unfortunate. And when we talk about something like psilocybin access, that's still even further away than ketamine. We're just now seeing the first FDA products start to make their way through the trials and maybe eventually get approved. We have a long road in front of us before anyone gets a reimbursement for psilocybin assisted therapy.
Yeah, and it's funny because as I think about that conversation, I remember talking to someone actually a couple weeks ago. They had purchased Numa. They were super excited about trying it. And then they went to the website and there was a reference on there for psychedelic therapy because the origin of how we created was really just for post-therapy benefits. And it was really cute because it was a really great conversation. And then she said, I also noticed, and she got really quiet and whispered, and it said psychedelics. And I was like, well, it doesn't have anything in it. And it was just so we can't even have the conversation without whispering or worrying about what other people are going to say or think, because it's still there's a lot of stigma
Right.
in what plant medicine offers.
Right. And so New Mexico acknowledges within its act that not everyone is going to have the resources to pay for this out of pocket. And that doesn't mean they don't need the medicine. Everyone at all aspects of society is affected by these conditions like major depressive disorder and PTSD that are designated under the act. And there has to be a way that everyone affected can at least try to get access. The Equity Fund is the first time we've seen a legislative recognition of the fact that psychedelic assisted therapy is a community issue. It's something that we all need to be invested in if we're going to solve our mental health crisis. So because we've acknowledged this, we've gotten past that idea that this is some kind of luxury that rich people who have problems can afford to do something about. We are now in this position of saying, hey, state, we've shown that there's bipartisan support for granting this access. What we are asking you to do now is invest in it. Put your money where your mouth is. Don't be the kind of mental health advocate that only talks about it, and spend money on helping the most vulnerable members of our society get healthier and move past the conditions that are affecting them.
So this is unique because it's bipartisan. One, I mean, when we watched this thing, it actually kind of went through pretty quickly. Like it went
really
through
did.
both committees, went through House, went through Senate, landed in finance. I mean, that was all within like a couple of, I felt like it was like a month and then it was like all done. I'm sure it was longer than that, but it felt like it was pretty quick because it was bipartisan.
Right. And I have to say, it's very much like Sabrina Carpenter. You have to work 10 years to be an overnight sensation. There was so much advocacy, like the New Mexico Psychedelic Science Society started in 2019 to start building this bill. There has been so much advocacy from Soul Trip and Las Cruces. All these organizations started and they started pushing the ball before anyone could see it. And then the right bill at the right time with the right sponsor lands in the New Mexico Senate and it moves through like wildfire. Only 12 legislators in either the House or the Senate, so both chambers combined, only 12 people voted against this bill. The will of the people has been very clearly expressed through their representatives. This is not something that we can debate anymore. And we're just hoping that the governor takes a look at that bipartisan support and sees this is overwhelmingly what New Mexicans want and so many New Mexicans need.
So, how is this, again, when you kind of look across the entire world? There's 240 different studies, I think, that are going on right now with all versions of entheogens and ethogens. And we can talk about the pathogens, we can talk about all of that. But I think there's 14 states right now that have some level of decrim or they're legal, as we know, in a couple, some that are don't ask, don't tell, we'll look the other way. I mean, but how does each state look at that? I mean, do you have any kind of an idea of like, because I know like with Maryland, we're looking at decriminalizing. So what does that really mean to the average person when we say that it's decriminalized? Or what does it mean when it's legal? Or what does it mean when it's like Louisiana, where it's just like flat out, we're not going to ban everything? And then I think we even heard with Florida, like they're even going to ban the spores, which we can kind of talk about in a second. But I mean, what are your thoughts on what are each of these? First, I guess let's go there first.
Right. There is a difference between decriminalization, legalization, and a medical model. What ends up happening when you decriminalize a substance is that you remove the criminal penalty for possession of, or sometimes even the sales of, depending on the state, that particular compound.
So for you so you as a former prosecutor in Louisiana, somebody gets picked up, they don't even get picked up anymore. Like, so your docket just like went all the way down because we're just not going to criminalize.
Right. I actually have some experience with this because I was a prosecutor when marijuana was decriminalized in the city of New Orleans. What we see with decriminalization is not that something is legal and it's totally fine to have and you can walk around with it everywhere. It's that the criminal penalty for it goes away. So you save all those prosecutorial resources and all those police resources. You stop having those community interactions that create so much negativity between the community and their government. But sometimes there is still a punishment involved here. Just because something is no longer a criminal act does not mean that you can't have like a civil fine for possession of it. For example, with a lot of the decrim movements in marijuana, what ended up happening when decriminalization went through in a specific city was that the police there were no longer picking people up for possession of marijuana, but they were issuing them a citation and they had to pay, a $25, $50, $100 fine. Decriminalization is a word that starts with advocacy that sometimes gets co-opted by forces in government to mean that we've just switched this over to a civil fine. And we as advocates have to be really careful when we talk about decriminalization instead of using the word legalization. Decriminalization is a great step. Getting people out of jail and out of being justice involved for these substances is a great step. But decriminalization does not mean legalization. And we have to be really careful when we look at our bills and our advocacy as we write it to make sure that when we are saying decriminalization, we're actually getting the benefits that we're looking for.
Yeah, and I think that's important because from our last conversation, I mean, the ones who are hit usually the hardest with any kind of access or I guess lack of access to the legal system are really this segment of the population who can't afford legal representation anyway. And oftentimes, whether it be a fine, whether it be incarceration or whatever, it ultimately affects them. So even when you're talking about decriminalization, finding somebody who chances are probably don't have the money, I mean, it's very, very important that we identify that decriminalization is not legalization. You still will incur penalties. You will still incur costs that could be prohibitive to you.
Right. And we have to be really careful because sometimes people use those two words interchangeably. There are a number of proposed decriminalization bills that are floating around the United States right now that are effectively legalization. And that's great. But we hear that word and we see it compared to things in other states and we kind of act like we're all making the same progress. And that's not necessarily true. When we say something has been legalized, what we're saying is that whatever is specified in that act, whether it's an amount, a substance, or both, is legal to possess. You cannot be punished for it civilly or criminally. You are acting within the bounds of acceptable conduct for society that you're in, and there is no enforcement mechanism that follows that. Decriminalization may still have an enforcement mechanism. It's just not a criminal enforcement mechanism. There's nothing on your criminal record. You can't go to jail. Legalization, there is no enforcement record anymore because you're acting in a legal manner. You're complying with the law. Then when we talk about the medical model, which is sometimes confusing for people, they see that a state has a medical program and think that means that something is decriminalized or legalized. Within a medical model, what the legislature or the government is doing is decriminalizing the possession and use of a certain thing or substance within very, very specific criteria. Most of them have some sort of licensing scheme where you are not committing a crime if you possess the substance with this license and use it under the rules that we have promulgated for you. Any other time that you possess this substance or use this substance in a way that's not specified under the bounds of the medical program, even if you have that license or even if you're a patient within it, it is still a crime. And that carve out of criminal liability, we've said this is not a crime under only these very specific circumstances, is most comparable for most people to something like self-defense. We all know that it's a crime to commit a battery, to walk up and punch somebody on the street. But let's say that somebody follows you out of a store and gets really close to you and you're at your car and then grabs your purse or grabs your bags, pulls you towards them, pushes you away, and you push back. In society, it's a crime for somebody to walk up and push another adult. But under those circumstances, it's not that you didn't commit the crime. It's that we've decided that that crime is not illegal. It's not a crime under those specific circumstances. So we can compare medical programs fairly easily to this idea that we all already understand. Medical programs are, just like self-defense, an exception to a rule that still exists, even though we have the exception.
So I think of a couple of things. So in the late 60s, we had several of these incredible organizations that were doing psychedelic research that would have had the medical model. I mean, they had clearance from the government. They were very controlled studies. I think of other programs like Sunstone Therapeutics, NYU, Robin Carhart Harris. I mean, they're all strictly doing this research. They've been given government clearance to be able to handle this kind of medication. But I know that when the 60s, when we had Nixon with his Schedule 1, basically all of these places got a letter that said, longer could you have any of these illegal substances. So they went from the medical model overnight to basically there was no more medical model when we rescheduled. Is that a fair?
Right. I will say that there is a difference between clinical trials and like a state medical model. A federal government or a state government might authorize a trial under a very limited circumstance to a specific person or group, whereas a medical model typically opens up that application for licenses to any qualified person within that geographic area.
Like Colorado, like what we're seeing right now.
Right.
So they said they're going to have so many applications that they're going to consider, and that will be it.
Right. So medical models are a little more open than what happened in the 60s with these very controlled licenses or clearances for trials. Those kinds of things still exist. The medical models are a little broader because they're opened up to market participants who can show that they're qualified and want to apply. That's great. But very similarly to what you're talking about, medical models are still subject to that same fragility. The idea that a state can pass a specific version of a medical model and then grant their licensees the ability to do this, and then the next legislative session take it all away and say we don't want to do this anymore, is still very real. It's why legalization is often the ultimate goal for a lot of advocates, whether they come to this through the decrim movement or through the medical model movement or some combination of both. Ultimately, unless this is your free conduct and you can go to your doctor and have this conversation regardless of who that doctor is and make the decisions that are right for you, there is still fragility to your access. And we have to be very aware of that.
So in the New Mexico case, with the passage of this, knowing that this is the governor's last term, could this change at the end of her term? Or is this something that is going to stay in Mexico or this current legislation?
So, this is planned to last for a very long time, and it's set up to be very stable. Right now, when we talk about this being the governor's last term, we're really talking about, is she going to sign this? Is this going to be part of her legacy? We don't know what her political aspirations might be after this, or her career aspirations might be after this. And she has, a lot of life to live. She's been an excellent governor. She's got a great reputation. She's got a lot left to go. How she sees positioning herself after being the governor might influence whether or not she signs or effectively desk vetoes, meaning just allows the time to pass this particular bill. She also might want to have some sort of financial legacy when it comes to how she leaves New Mexico's budget. So whether or not she line item vetoes things like the equity fund or the research fund may be influenced by these things we cannot know. She might be leaving politics forever. She might run for president. But given that amount of variability, we as advocates can't let up. We've got to keep calling the governor's office and sending these emails and saying, you want this to be part of your legacy. So many people have put their lives, careers, reputations on the line to get this to your desk. Why did they do that? And we invite you to consider that. If this passes and she signs it into law, the program will not start seeing patients probably until March of 2028. So I expect we're going to see several legislative sessions pass with no activity or very little activity on the medical side of psychedelics. I expect, or I predict, that most legislative activity we see will be on the decriminalization side of psychedelics between now and the institution of the program. When the program becomes instituted and we start seeing patients, I think that's when we might see some tweaks to the program, or we might see the program evolve and take on a new form.
Yeah, I think I remember hearing some number. I think it was a year and a half ago. We need about 100,000. Should this all become legal tomorrow, like we would need 100,000 new either social workers or people to come into this program like the next day in order to create an infrastructure that was even worth at the most basic level for having this type of assisted therapy. So I can see why, if we're talking 28, we're trying to build an infrastructure here for New Mexico and for the New Mexicans to have some baseline of what that's going to look like. Is that probably inaccurate?
Yeah, exactly. We want to have a clear licensing scheme so that if you're a provider and you want to join this network, you know what your requirements are and how to apply. We also have to build up the infrastructure because all of this product will be grown in New Mexico for producers and growers. They have to know what their licensing looks like. They have to know what treatment protocol they're trying to meet so that they can refine their spores and their fruiting bodies to meet with the requirements of the program. Whenever you have a medical model, you're going to end up with a really specified idea of what can be used within that program for any substance. With ketamine, this is really easy. We know exactly what it is, but there's significant variance in anything that's a grown out of the ground kind of natural product. So when they're going to be defining down what it means to be a grower that participates in this program and what kind of testing has to be done on your fruiting bodies to be able to use them within the program, that infrastructure has to be built up too. None of this product can cross state lines without violating federal law. So all of that has to happen within the agricultural community of New Mexico. And we've done a really smart thing, I think, in giving people all of this time. I've heard a lot of disappointment expressed around the idea that the program will not officially start until probably December 31st, 2027. Technically, it could start earlier under the bill, but that's the date, that's the drop dead date. And then the first patients will not be treated until 2028. I understand that disappointment. I really do. And it can feel like that's forever away. But when it comes to refining spores, refining dosing protocol, building a testing infrastructure, letting people apply, selecting the correct licensees and the correct growers, and getting those first patients through the door, that is a rapid fire timeline. It's enough
I mean,
time, but
yeah.
it's not more than enough.
Well, and it seems reasonable. Again, I know we all want things tomorrow. Like that's just what we do. But I mean, it seems reasonable to me because you have to vet who is a responsible grower, who is not, building the testing infrastructure, all of the things that we wouldn't even consider because again, it is agricultural. As we're even talking about this, I'm thinking about just all the different kinds of spores that there potentially are. Some are stronger, some are weaker. I think the dosing protocols behind that. I think about my TikTok page when I talk about this a lot. I always have like hey man, we have shrooms, and so I think about that. Like I think about the guy who's selling the shrooms as opposed to a responsible medical model of somebody that's going to be able to replicate a reputable product every time instead of just somebody out of the back of their truck.
Exactly. And I want to express that I have a lot of respect for growers who are figuring this out for themselves wherever that is. You take the risks that you think are appropriate for your own body and your own mind. But for me, as a lawyer and as someone who's interested in protecting market participants and seeing this grow in a legal way so that there's some stability for people, I have to look at this and say the agricultural component of this is going to make or break the program. Whether or not we can give growers a reliable, a clear testing protocol, a clear ability to participate in the program is going to determine whether or not there's even enough product for patients to access what it is that they need to access, and for our clinician participants to be able to maintain a stable and really long-term workable practice. We have to think about the agricultural elements of this first and allow people to get to a point where they can meet that level of production.
And again, I kind of think back to, and we talked about this in our last episode about cannabis. I feel like there were a lot of states where we just said, yeah, all right, we're going to open the doors. And then you had some guy in a tent with a green card who would just sell you for $50 a card, and then you can just go and buy his. Or I've seen in other places where you pay a fee, you get a checklist, and then you can take off with your chocolate bar. So when we're talking about this, never really occurred to me how important like combining all of these other like agriculture, like that's something that we wouldn't really even think about, and how that was important to make or break this model, and making sure that they even have enough growing, enough testing protocols, I mean, to make it again reputable and able to be replicated over and over again, but having that done consistently.
I'm sure you've seen the stories out of New York and New Jersey's cannabis markets recently, where people have purchased, as kind of secret shoppers, different product at different dispensaries and tested it and found that it may be contaminated with mold. It may not have the levels of THC that are advertised or the terpenes that are advertised. And you've also seen a lot of product that very much looks like it is not from those two areas. It is pretty easy to tell when an agricultural infrastructure is not as built out as it needs to be. And we're all going to have those growing pains and we're all going to make those mistakes. But here in New Mexico, we have time. We have an opportunity to test this product multiple times before it ever goes to a patient or is sold to a provider. We have a lot of ability to refine within this Department of Health and Medical Psilocybin Advisory Board partnership that will exist. What spores we want used, what we want that whole fruiting body to look like, what the dosage protocol is. They've discussed this as a whole mushroom dosing protocol. So I suspect that we will get really specific about what spores those are, which flush it is, what your substrate is, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm really excited to see the state of New Mexico invest in growers. Oftentimes, when we have medical models, the people that are left out of any kind of stability or profit growth that comes from these things are the agricultural people at the bottom of the supply chain. And here we have the opportunity to do the opposite.
And I was thinking, as you were saying that, typically when you see bills that are being sponsored, they're normally by big industrial something, and the last one that is ever really considered is the grower, the farmer, or the downstream vendor, if you will. So that is really unique. That's really great. But as we're thinking about all this from a legal compliance, again, we want consistency. So what does that infrastructure look like? Because I know we've had this conversation before where we don't really think about this. We don't think about the compliance agriculture. I mean, the compliance side of things on an infrastructure. We wait until after, and then we're like, oops, really probably should have thought that through first, but we didn't. So why is that important?
So, as a lawyer, I think I can acknowledge the fact that I am biased towards compliance. I want people to follow the rules. I have seen the consequences when you get sued after you don't follow the rules and how expensive it is. So much more expensive not to comply. But on a very baseline level, compliance infrastructure is important for efficiency purposes. There's been a lot of talk about government efficiency recently. And one of the biggest elements we leave out of that conversation is how efficient is this government at motivating proactive compliance versus punishment. It takes a tremendous amount of resources to enforce regulations. So we have to structure them such that there is motivation to comply before you get an enforcement action.
Well, and I think oftentimes too, there's so much like variation of what is law, what's not law, what's compliance, what isn't compliance. Don't ask, don't tell. I mean, we're seeing a lot, in the employer space with employer health plans being sued for a lack of disclosure or lack of it's almost to me reminiscent and tangent of the 401ks from like 15 years when there was
Right.
all this lack of disclosure. Employers are now being sued by their employees saying, hey, you didn't tell me where things were. So it could have just been as simple as I just didn't know. Like, I
Right.
didn't know that I had to do that. So ignorance isn't always bliss here.
It is not. There's a phrase that my mom always uses that's like, it's a penny smart and a pound foolish. What I see with a lot of businesses and a lot of healthcare providers as well is that legal's really expensive and starting up a business is very expensive. So they look at legal and they go, oh, I don't need that until I get sued. And they leave that out of structuring the business. And when you're a provider or a business person who has a million things on your plate, structuring the business to meet those particular skills that you have allow you to provide the most care to patients, allow you to make a great product and get a good profit off of it, often is something you're very good at. And something you might not be really good at is figuring out how to do that in a way that builds compliance into the way that you run your business or practice.
Kind of like insurance.
Right.
It's one of those things that you hope that you never have to use, but it's essential to have.
Right. And so when you don't make that investment early on and build your business in a way that's compliant, what ends up happening is things are fine for a while, and then inevitably things are not fine. And when things are not fine, fixing that mistake, defending that lawsuit, paying those clawbacks to your insurance, whatever it is inevitably way more expensive than that initial legal or consultant or combined legal and consultant bill that you would have had at the beginning that seemed so insurmountable. I always tell people you want to pay for that relationship early on that builds your business in a compliant way because you do not want to find out what people's litigation billable hour rate is.
And oftentimes, I mean, from an employer standpoint, a lot of these are corporate attorneys that are either, I mean, they're not even billable. They're just like in-house corporate counsels who can just do this for as long as they need to. This is part of the cost of doing business.
Exactly. That's why my firm has shifted to a primarily fractional general counsel option. There are so many businesses in this space that really need a lawyer on staff. They have enough legal need, they need a lawyer on staff. But they do not have that kind of capital. And that is completely understandable. A lot of people are coming in pre-revenue or they're coming in with some debt to start this business. And we understand that. You can't hire a lawyer and pay that salary initially. But what you can do with a firm like ours is you can pay into a monthly plan or quarterly plan that's customized for what you need and be able to know what your monthly bill is going to be every month. Be able to pick up the phone and ask legal questions whenever you have questions. You don't have catch-up costs because these people are constantly involved in your business and they know what's going on. And you can just have those conversations and have that continuing relationship without watching the clock and wondering what that bill is going to be. You get to benefit from having a lawyer on staff without also paying a lawyer's full salary because we have a couple of clients that are doing this or a few clients that are doing this. That salary is divided amongst the entire coterie of people who want to work this way. And it's incredibly advantageous to the clients because they get that feeling of having a lawyer on staff and that kind of service. But it's incredibly advantageous to us too, because we can look at how many clients we can take and really devote our attention to without having to hustle for billable hours and maybe put your email to the bottom of the pile because there's a litigation deadline coming up.
Wow. So that actually happens?
Yeah. Um, it's very interesting. I came from big law. I came from a giant law firm. After leaving state service as a prosecutor, I worked in one of the largest law firms in the United States. And what I saw happen very frequently in big law firms that were organized in this kind of billable hour model way is that your smaller client typically has more legal needs than your larger client. Your larger client typically has a GC on staff that you're working with for things that they need to outsource. But their legal strategy and their legal portfolio was being managed by somebody who's in-house. Because of that, and because they're controlling so much of your business, your smaller client who really needs everything done all the time, all at once, and who needs somebody who really detailed knows what's going on with their business, has trouble getting the service that they need out of that big law firm because that big client can demand so much time with their large book and their large cash flow. So you might get that email response 3 days later instead of a day later. With the fractional general counsel model, I and the other women in my firm can look at our book and see, like, okay, how many people am I promising myself to be this fractional general counsel for? How many people can I really guarantee that I'm going to respond to as fast as possible? How many people can I priority schedule a meeting whenever they need it with? And I can cap that number of clients. I can set myself a limit. And then when people want to come on to a plan like that, they really are getting the convenience of having me in their office. I sometimes will participate in corporate governance for people, I'll help them work out the structures of their things. A founder might come to me and say, hey, I want you to help me plan my succession for this business for after I retire. And we can do all of that because I already know what's happening within your company. I don't have to read a million documents and catch up every time and bill you for the 3 hours it takes to figure out what happened since the last matter.
Wow. I mean, that makes so much more sense. And I'm surprised why more people aren't doing that.
Yeah, it's a creative way of practicing law, and there are some reasons why it might not be right for you. Like, there are still some services that we have to offer hourly because of how the courts track those bills, and we might be trying to pursue legal fees from the other side. There are, big law firms that are primarily working with insurance companies that have an entire infrastructure built around that hourly bill. And the idea of switching to something like fractional general counsel just wouldn't work for the infrastructure that they already have. We are not the right lawyer for everyone, but for the business that really does need a lawyer on staff, but isn't there yet and is trying to fill in that gap between the need developing and the time when you can really support someone 24/7, fractional general counsel is a great option. And a lot of businesses, especially small to medium-sized enterprises, never really get past that gap. And those are the businesses that tend to get into the most compliance trouble. They have all the needs, they don't have the lawyer on staff, and then this develops into very expensive litigation. So we've tried to
Yeah, I mean, as you're saying that, I'm almost thinking too. It's like, well, we'll just kick the can down the road. Or I see this a lot too with companies. Sales are not really growing the way that I want. So the first thing I'm going to cut is advertising. I'm going to cut my social media, or I'm going to cut my spend on attracting new clients, because it's like the easiest like line item that they can see, like
Right.
insurance.
Exactly. Like, looking at line items gets really complicated. We've tried to position ourselves in the market for people who did not have an option before. When you're in this gap and you have all these legal needs that are developed, but you do not yet have that kind of ability to pull in somebody as staff full time, there used to not really be an option other than hourly. You had to go with individual matters, you had to quote multiple people and try to find something that you could afford. And that was really the limit. There wasn't another option for you. We have at this point positioned ourselves such that there is another option. And because there is another option, we are finding that people can grow better, can do better, and can be more effective for what it is that they need.
Awesome. So now let's go back to, lastly, the employers. So this is a gigantic step forward in mental health. So when I think about this, I always put on my insurance hat because I had done this for 30 years. How is this going to be different in New Mexico for employers? Like, from a mental health perspective, we know, and I just saw you had posted the veteran survey yesterday, and just looking at the numbers, while they're going down, it's still the suicide rate among veterans is astronomical.
Astronomical.
Same for, non-VA, non-veterans in the survey. How are employers going to look at this potentially different in New Mexico? And go, more importantly, how do we think about this from an employer perspective down the road? Like, we know that we've already talked about Colorado and Oregon are illegal. We've got other states that are considering versions of this. But how do we as an employer, how do employers look at this?
I'm so glad that you asked this question. It's incredibly timely, especially considering a recent decision we just saw about the ADA. We have a very, very recent case that just came out in which a plaintiff was fired by their employer for their participation in a medical marijuana program. Within that medical marijuana program, this person used marijuana off the job. They never came to the job site impaired. Still, despite all of that, they were fired from their job and their claim under the ADA was dismissed. Their employer was allowed to do that. So patients need to be aware of the fact that just because there's a medical program in your state that allows you to access something does not necessarily mean that you are protected from your employer firing you for participation in that program. It is a devastating blow to employees who need to access these services to be the best that they possibly can be at their jobs. And it is where I think we will see the next round of litigation when it comes to psychedelic assisted therapy. Right now, we see a lot of free speech stuff and church stuff. I think the next round is going to be the requirement of employers to accept participation in these kinds of programs and whether that requirement exists. In New Mexico, what we have seen so far is that there's a lot of popular support for people participating in these programs. And psilocybin is a really good substance for something like this. If you're taking psilocybin under the protocol that's laid out in this Medical Psilocybin Act, you're in a facility with a guided person and you're not leaving until the experience is over. So there really is no danger that you're going to be showing up to the job site impaired. Nobody's giving you any substance that you're leaving the therapeutic site with. So for employers, this is an incredibly safe kind of protocol and option. So what we're hoping to see is, look, employers, we've set this up to be incredibly safe. And you now have this resource that's been shown to make your employees happier and more productive. You should support this, and you should consider adding this as an employee benefit, especially if your employees work in a very high stress field. We have some technical difficulties.
Yeah, I think we're back. That was really interesting. It's never happened before.
So strange.
Yeah, so we were talking about employers and the medical model and why it was safe.
Yeah. Like I was saying, we have this medical model where you're not leaving with any kind of substance, right? And you're not leaving the area where you're receiving treatment until after the experience is over. So there's no reason to believe anybody's going to show up to the job site impaired in any way as a result of their participation in New Mexico's medical psilocybin.
Which is so insane to me because alcohol is 100% legal, and I can show up completely wasted and still be protected by the ADA and not have any problem. I just have to say that I'm an alcoholic. The other thing that, as you're kind of talking about this too, so every state has state mandates that go into their health insurance benefits.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering too, like, if this passes and this becomes part of the New Mexico state mandated benefits, that means that employers would have to cover this type of therapy. It would have to be covered under all fully insured medical plans. And that's where I think health insurance gets really interesting because, Maryland has 54 state mandates that are completely different than New Jersey, are completely different than Michigan, which are completely different than Louisiana, which are completely different than New Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
So New Mexico is going to have to look at the legislation and say, we think because this Medical Psilocybin Act was passed, the governor puts it into bill, into law, we now are going to fund it. That means insurance plans may technically have to start covering it if it becomes a state mandated benefit.
Right. I think we need to start having that conversation. That has not yet been part of the New Mexico medical psilocybin conversation at a very high level. Part of the reason for that is that any FDA approved psilocybin products are deliberately left out of the New Mexico Medical Psilocybin Act. So anything that's approved by the FDA, and I know we have one that might be getting close, they're not part of the program. They're prescribed totally differently, and they're an exception. What we really need to see, and what I hope we'll see the next legislative session, if this is signed into law, is a conversation about interpretation of what has to be a state mandate and whether or not this needs to be part of that state mandate. We're not there yet, and I think it's going to be a much more uphill battle than just access, but I think we should do it. We've all, as a psychedelics community, really coalesced around the medical research that has proven that these substances are not just some kind of fun drug. And they're not. And now that research gives us yet another tool in the continuing uphill battle for what will eventually, hopefully, be equitable access. This has happened incredibly piecemeal and incredibly step by step. And I think when we get to a point where we have evidence that the program is working and that there are more positive stories from people who are here in New Mexico coming out of the program, we're going to have a lot more ammunition to start adding to that list of state mandated healthcare requirements.
Yeah, because as you're talking about that, I'm thinking of, I mean, ketamine, we talked about this earlier on. I mean, Spravato is the only one covered because it's the only one that's actually gone through clinical trial and had FDA approval. Everything else is not covered because it is an off-patent labeled generic drug that off patent literally means not really covered for that. But this is a completely different ball of wax. Like this is, I mean, we're talking about stuff again, agricultural growing, something from the ground that was created that would be a completely different model from anything else that we've actually ever seen. The ramifications are huge.
Exactly. When you're talking about an agricultural product, you start to get into like a lot of what we heard in the 60s about how can something that is just a plant that occurs growing from the ground be regulated by the government? And we're going to have to answer that question now. We've gotten to a point where we're going to have to answer how can a whole mushroom product that is not processed other than being picked and dried be considered a regulated product? And then once we get that thing regulated and once we get our hands around that, how can we mandate that an employer pay for access under certain circumstances to that kind of whole agricultural product?
Yeah, because then you're now asking the question chicken or egg. Because in most states, you kind of get around the rules of growing your own bags by having the spores that have the potential to be a mushroom, but they're not. They're just
Right.
a spore used for medical research. And in Florida, just recently just passed that they're even making having spores illegal as well.
And it's interesting the difference between like a spore and a fruiting body, right? We've seen people trademark certain spores and like names for them. I believe Wiz Khalifa has his own spores. These very slight genetic differences in psilocybin and psilocybin producing mushrooms are intellectual property, or at least potential intellectual property. And so when you have something like that, where I can say, my spore is slightly different than your spore, and I've trademarked the name, and this is my proprietary spore, and we know that in first flush, it'll produce mushrooms that contain this much psilocybin, and then in second and third, that will decrease by this percentage. Okay, if I want to protect my intellectual property, how does that become part of a regulated medical program? I don't think we know. And I
No.
think and I think what we will eventually see, if I had to guess, and this is, me putting on my clairvoyant hat for a second, I think we will see certain spores identified by research institutions in states, specifically colleges and universities that are doing like large scale long term research on this. And then those spores will be required as the basis for the fruiting bodies that are accepted into the program.
So going back to New Mexico, I mean, to make the list, I mean, we would have to know because it again have to be replicatable every time. It has to be the exact same consistency. So I'm sure that they're going to look at all of that for the IP behind it.
I think so. And I think when we talk about the crossover of IP and psychedelics and medical models and psychedelics, what we're going to find is that those two markets are going to develop relatively independently of each other.
Definitely. And then, again, I think back to the insurance side of this because for an insurance company, whether it be a state mandated benefit or not, there has to be some level of FDA compliance, unless it's a self funded employer plan. And then you have the problem of ERISA and being covered under the federal. And if they're still Schedule 1 drug, how does it get around creating the exception? for coverage for an employer plan that technically has a Schedule 1 still attached.
I think that is going to be incredibly complicated. And I think that's why also we're seeing some of these psilocybin-based products be fast-tracked through the FDA. Because I think that the FDA is very aware that there's a lot of interest in access to these substances, and the body of research is becoming too looming, too large to ignore. As that continues to loom large, we have to do something about it before we lose our ability to do anything about it.
Yeah, it's becoming a runaway train that I think the federal government is now starting to see, saying, "Hey,
I hope so. I hope we're at a point where people are starting to realize that this is not an avoidable conversation anymore, and that insurance has such a terrible perspective throughout so much of society, especially health insurance. I mean, look at the Luigi Mangione case and how many people showed up to support Luigi Mangione, despite it being absolutely clear what happened in that particular circumstance. That is, I think, an indictment on the public perception of health insurance companies at this point. And with psychedelics being so overwhelmingly popular, health insurance companies are in this position where they have a very clear, easy way of improving their reputation and improving, kind of societal buy-in into the insurance system overall, but are having to do so within a very slow-moving federal context. And I think making those kinds of business decisions, especially when you're talking about paper that's not held in the United States and may have all kinds of other cultural and social risks attached to it, it is going to be interesting.
very interesting." So yeah, again, because I look at this from a purely health insurance, been doing this thing forever, and then looking at how on earth are we going to make these things accessible and legal outside of the current frame that we have? It's almost uphill nightmare. I mean,
It
so
really is. Descheduling is the most efficient path forward, but I don't know that we're going to see descheduling anytime soon.
agree.
And I think that even rescheduling, even like Schedule 3, a lot of people say that Schedule 3 is massive amount of progress, and I agree with them. But I also agree with the decriminalization and legalization advocates that say that any schedule will inhibit access and will inhibit medical research. I think that they're both right. And so seeing how we untangle the web that we've weaved with the drug war in order to best allow people to access the medications that they need is going to be a 10, 15-year conversation. This is not going to happen tomorrow.
Yeah, because it's taken us how long to get here? I mean, since 1971. So to be able to do this overnight is nearly impossible.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean there's not hope. All of these state programs being successful are providing research that was previously not accessible to people elsewhere. And the more that we can add to this body of knowledge, the more weapons in their tool belt or more tools in their tool belt people have to make the argument that they should be able to do this in their state and that they should be able to start adding to that research as well. And then the case for descheduling builds and builds and builds in a less and less ignorable fashion. There's a lot of hope in the psychedelic movement. Hello, this is my cat.
Hi.
Her name is Lovely, and she will send you an invoice for her appearance on this podcast.
Nice.
But this hope, this joy that I have around the psychedelics movement comes from the fact that there's a real practical application to the data that comes out of these state programs, even if they're not as accessible as we want them to be, even if they depend on equity funding for people to get access, even if most patients, even 99% of patients, pay out of pocket. That's obviously not what we're shooting for. It's not the end. It's not what we want. But that data that comes out gives us a leg up towards the next argument that we need to make. People sometimes call this a slippery slope, but it's a slippery slope towards access and better health. And that's exactly the direction that we should be going.
Again, I mean, when you think about how all of what we call drugs, so coffee, alcohol, tobacco, I mean, we're okay with all of those things. And it's not that this is a drug or not a drug, but I mean, that it just requires education like anything else. It takes time. The amazing people who are doing this incredible work on the front lines and behind the scenes, I mean, they're unsung heroes. As you're talking about this, I'm thinking of all of the interviews I've seen with Rick Doblin over the last 40, 50 years of his relentless pursuit of the betterment of society at so many costs. So much ridicule, so many interviews where he just had nasty things they said to him and he just continues to roll with his mission. And I think that's what's happening. And it's really exciting to see how Mexico is taking really kind of the front of all of what is going on right now and running with a completely new, in my opinion, better model.
I think that it's one that really builds on the experts that came before us. I'm 34 years old. I turned 35 this month. And I was not even alive. I wasn't even a thought. My parents weren't even married when the previous psychedelics movement in the United States hit the wall that was the Controlled Dangerous Substances Act. There have been literal generations of people that made my life and career possible in the face of extreme ridicule, prison time. Some of them have been deported. There have been horrible consequences to talking about these substances and how they might be helpful for other people. The education and the legalization and the advocacy movements have come at an extreme cost to everyone that came before me. And now, as a human being who has a lot less at stake than the people who came before me did, who has much more acceptance and a much friendlier environment to talk about these things in, I just look back, and as sad as it is that we're not going to get this descheduled tomorrow, the indomitability of the human spirit that got us to this point is what brought me to psychedelics in the first place. We are surrounded by so many kind, intelligent people who refused to back down and who said that human beings can have a better life and they don't have to suffer like this. And I am just in awe that I get to be a part of the work that came before me and get to move this ball forward even another inch. There's so much hope. And for business owners, there's so much growth too. We've seen the global psychedelics market triple in the past 2 years with projected growth, year over year of doubling by up until 2030. We're seeing people who are willing to take these risks and willing to join the chorus of voices towards the betterment of humanity, be able to do so while making sustainable money and building lives for themselves. We are part of something that's making the world better. And I'm so thankful that people like you and other people have created this world that allows my generation to be a part of it.
I am completely humbled by that conversation because it's something that you don't really ever think about. And I know that there are so many more generations, like you're saying, that were ahead of us. And I remember sitting down last year, I think it was May, with some of the OG, like behind the scenes, scientific, like serious, like I was in awe of the work that they did in the 60s and 70s, and talking about the filing cabinets of research that they had that was all scrapped overnight. Like just hearing like the passion in their voice, like even now, here we are, decades later, and they're still fighting the fight. Look at that in awe, and you never think I'm part of that too. So thank you for that reminder, because we don't remember. And I know for many of us, we're not in this for glory. We're not in this for anything other than know what the potential is for a happier, better humanity. And that's at the end of the day, all we want.
I try to remember this phrase that is chanted in certain Zen Buddhist services that I've been a part of, that so as they were Buddhas and ancestors, we will become Buddhas and ancestors. We're all part of this unbroken chain of humanity that has gotten us to this point, good and bad, and will continue to improve or get worse based on our actions. We're not somehow different from the people that came before us. We are them. We exist because of everything that they did. And that next generation of psychedelics advocates is going to exist based on what we do now. And I'm so excited to get to be a part of it and get to meet culture bearers and intellectual bearers like you and so many other people in this space. And I think that I want this conversation to be representative of both the challenges and the extreme hope and potential that exists in this space. Just because it's complicated doesn't mean we won't get it done.
I love that. And I couldn't have said that better myself. And thank you again for your wisdom, for just being you. I've enjoyed our conversation offline as well as on our show, but you have brought such different perspectives. I think what is being done in New Mexico, in the way that you're able to just look at where you started. Like, I mean, just like when I think about you being a prosecuting attorney and then coming to the other side and bringing that depth of knowledge, and how right. I mean, it takes a community, it takes a village of all of us just to wake up and remember who we are so that we as a community can actually move forward in whatever healing looks.
Absolutely. I'm so glad to be a part of it. And thank you for having me on the show.
So get involved. I normally don't close shows like this, but I felt compelled today that There are so many conversations that are happening all over the country, all over the world. Intellectual conversations, conversations of those who are trying to pick up the pieces of whatever their lives look like, whether that be depression, whether that be trauma. There's room in this space for all of us. And I always go back to, I had a conversation with somebody that I really endear to a couple of years ago, and she pointed her finger at me. She said, "You're everything that's wrong with this industry." And I looked at, and I go, "What do you mean?" She says, "When people like you wake up, it's an incredible thing. There'll be people behind you who may not have the same intention." I disagree with that now. I think because just as what you're saying, we're all in this together, good, bad, indifferent. We get to take this opportunity to be able to take what we've learned, pass the torch to the next one, very same as the ones who passed to us. And we take those experiences and we learn with them. And that's why I created the show. That's why I have conversations like this week with people who are doing great things, people who want to be able to educate from their perspective. Again, I've never really believed in the construct of good or bad. I think there only is. We look at what is bad. We have to look at that from where that lens of programming comes from our churches, religions, governments, neighbors, doesn't really matter. But I think asking the question as a community, again, I didn't say society, I said a community, because it doesn't matter red, blue, where you live, economic, we're all community. And asking the right question, what I can do to advance healing forward, is more important than any other things. We figure those things out as we progress. I felt compelled to say that today. To Alan Wiederhold, this is Numa. And if you enjoyed the show, please like, subscribe, tell a friend. We continue to make this show possible just because we're passionate about healing and again about community. So this is Alan. Thank you.
Thanks.
That was so awesome.